Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Today, inshallah, we'll be discussing a period in Islamic history which is a very important period but is highly understudied and very little is known about by the Muslims of today. But really, this is a very important period, and it shows why Islam and how actually Islam spread through Western Anatolia into Western Europe. This period is the Battle of Manzikert, and the importance can actually be seen through the writings in an article written in the Oxford Bibliographies. It's titled The Battle of Manzikert, and there the author, he says, the decisive defeat of a Byzantine field army and capture of the Eastern Roman Empire. It sent shockwaves across the Christian and Islamic worlds and opened the floodgates of Turkish invasion and migration into Anatolia. So really it shows how the Battle of Manzikert, how it paved the way for Islam through the Turks to spread into Anatolia and into Western Europe. And really it shows how the world today it was shaped. Now, before we do actually go into the period, we look into the battle itself, let's contextualize briefly the period that we are studying. So, the Romans and the Arabs, they've been fighting for a very, very long time, the Romans and the Muslims. And the Muslims had been winning most of these battles and delivering decisive defeats to the Roman Empire. And even had actually threatened Constantinople under the Umayyads, which was the first siege that the Muslims had laid to Constantinople in the 8th century. But obviously they weren't successful, and Constantinople was taken by the Ottoman Empire in 1453. Nonetheless, then obviously when the Abbasid Khilafah took over, they started shifting their attention towards Central Asia and more into Eastern Asia, and started expanding that way. And then in the late 9th century and 10th century, we see the advent of smaller Islamic states and independent states which started to break away from the centralized power of the Abbasid Khilafah. And one of these states that actually rose up is very amazing, a nomadic tribe who were more accustomed to tribal life and nomadic ways. With the Seljuk, they rose up and formed the Seljuk Empire. Now this was a very vast empire, one of the biggest Muslim states to exist. They spread all the way from Iran to northern Syria and even took Transcaucasia. Now when they'd taken Transcaucasia, this really sparked the bigger fights with the Roman Empire and the Fatimid Khilafah. Now, when the Abbasid Khilafah started collapsing, the Romans, they started taking their holdings in Eastern Anatolia and northern Syria. They started taking some of these fortresses back, and then they built a chain of fortresses along their eastern border to prevent Muslim invasion. But then Sultan Alp-Arslan, after the conquest of Transcaucasia, he started taking these fortresses, and in 1064 he actually took Ani. And after he took this, literally the fortresses fell like a domino, one after the other. Manzikert fell, then Ahlat, and these were followed by Antioch, Military, and Caesarea in 1067. In just 4 years, he'd taken about 6 fortresses of the Roman Empire. And then to make matters worse, in 1067, the Roman Emperor Constantine, he passed away, Constantine X. And this sort of sparked a bit of internal political turmoil in the Byzantine Empire. But then his widow, she quickly married General Romanos, and he was from a powerful family, and he became the emperor. Now, he was actually quite firm in wanting to drive out the Muslims from the Eastern Anatolia. And so in 1068, he gathered a large army and marched towards Caesarea. Now, there was obviously a Seljuk army there, and we don't really know exactly what happened, but he he defeated the Seljuks at the Battle of Teprike. And then further skirmishes continued, and Romanos finally decided, okay, I need a large army to defeat these Muslims. And while this was happening, actually Sultan Alp-Arslan, he was also occupied because he was fighting the Fatimid Khilafah in Syria. So he sent an emissary to negotiate a truce with Emperor Romanos. And Romanos, because he was obviously trying to gather a large army, he accepted. And while the truce was in effect, he gathered a 100,000 man army. Now some obviously say 200,000, some even go all the way up to 400,000. But given the strength of the Roman Empire at that time, 100,000 would be the more plausible estimate. So then in February 1017, Romanos, he renewed the peace treaty with Sultan Alp-Arslan, but his intention wasn't to continue peace, because a month later he marched out against the Seljuk Empire. He started marching towards an area called Van, and he took a fortress called Theodosopolis, if I said that right, in July. So then obviously Sultan Alp-Arslan, he heard about this, and he immediately lifted the siege that he was besieging the Fatimid Khilafah, and he immediately lifted this siege. And because obviously he knew about the area quite well, he secretly moved back to Iran through still going beside Lake Van, but he didn't encounter the Roman Empire, the Roman army. And when he went back to Iran, he actually gathered 10,000 more men in his army, and so they numbered around 30,000 then. And then what happened is Romanos, he marched towards Manzikert, and when he was laying siege to Manzikert, because he had 60,000 men, he sent 30,000 to watch the southeastern area of Lake Van. But then Sultan Alp-Arslan, he actually, because again he knew the area very well, and the Romans, they didn't place any reconnaissance in the area. So Sultan Alp-Arslan, he actually came from the northeast, and he defeated the 30,000 man army. And then very cunningly, what he did is he used his spies to spread the news that Emperor Romanos had been killed. So then the remainder of the army that was left, the 30,000 that he defeated, whoever was left in that army, they retreated back to Constantinople, because they thought the emperor's dead, we ain't gonna stick around, let's go back, because what's the point of fighting him without, there is no general command left. So then Sultan Alp-Arslan, he went to fight the main Roman army that was besieging Manzikert. And in August, before Sultan Alp-Arslan encountered the main army, Romanos had actually taken Manzikert. And then on the 25th of August, the Seljuks and the main Roman army, they met on the battlefield. But the emperor, Romanos, he actually sent a messenger to the 30,000 man army he dispatched to watch the southeastern area of Lake Van. But he didn't know that Sultan Alp-Arslan, he'd been watching, he'd defeated that army. So we can see that one of the main reasons for their defeat is because the poor leadership of General Romanos, and the fact that he just didn't know what he was doing. And then so obviously the next day, Romanos and his 50,000 men, they formed up a crescent formation, and Sultan Alp-Arslan, Romanos, he formed up a 50,000 man army, and he himself led the center. Sultan Alp-Arslan, his army, the Seljuks, they formed their crescent formation, and Alp-Arslan himself also led the center of his army. Romanos, and then when the battle started, Romanos, he ordered his full army forward, and the Seljuks, they decided to retreat and employ a hit and run instead of engaging in a all-out battle. So then what happened is, by afternoon, the Byzantine army, they had actually taken the Seljuk camp, and so it became very difficult for the Seljuks. But this is where Romanos again made a very terrible mistake. He ordered in the evening his army to retreat. Obviously, because it's getting dark and you're in the Seljuk camp, you don't know what's going to happen, you want to retreat. but this order, it spread chaos amongst the Byzantine army. And what happened in this is that some sources say that the emperor's flag, his banner, had actually fallen. So then what happened is, through the cover of night, the cover of the dark, Sultan Alparslan, he took his center and he attacked the the left wing of the Roman army, and they'd become encircled. So the left wing, it completely collapsed. And then the right wing, they thought that the emperor had died, so they also retreated, and a lot of them were obviously killed while retreating, but a lot of them managed to retreat and go back to Constantinople. The reserve cavalry that was left, they also didn't engage because it was led by a man who also had some rivalry with Romanos, so he just retreated. And then obviously now all that's left in the battlefield is the whole Seljuk army and only Romanos' center. And then the Seljuks, they encircled Romanos' center. But obviously the Seljuks, they put up a fight, but they couldn't deal with this because it was just too many men. The Seljuk had such a huge numerical advantage. So the Romanos' center collapsed, and Romanos himself was actually taken prisoner by a ordinary Seljuk soldier. So when he was taken prisoner, he was called back he was taken back to the Seljuk capital, and there he was treated nicely. Even the Romans claim that he was treated in a nice manner. And there they agreed that Romanos would pay reparations for the war that he caused, and a marriage between Romanos' daughter and Sultan Alparslan's son. And so this would obviously create a truce between them and peace, and then obviously Alparslan could focus on fighting the Fatimid Khilafah. And then after this was agreed, Sultan Alparslan released Romanos a couple days later. But when he returned, the Romans had actually crowned another emperor, and so when he returned, it sparked a civil war, and between the new Roman emperor and Romanos' followers. But it ended very quickly because Romanos lost and he died. He didn't really have many followers, so the civil war was quickly ended with Romanos losing, and he actually died. And then because of this battle, the victory that they had, the Byzantine Empire, they suffered a huge defeat, and their army, they lost a huge chunk of their army, 50,000 men, and then also the other 30,000, which a lot of them also, although they retreated, a lot of them were also killed. And so the Seljuks, they would go much deeper into Anatolia and even threaten Constantinople itself. But this wouldn't be under Sultan Alparslan, who wouldn't live to really see the army go very deep into Anatolia. It would happen under his son Sultan Malik Shah, who inshallah in future episodes we will go further into his life and his conquests. And really, to study the Seljuk Empire not much is known about this great empire, but they'd fought against because they didn't really last very long as a huge empire. And when we think about Turkish Empire, we really think about the Ottoman Empire, who's very large and lasted for 700-800 years, about 600-700 years. But really, the Seljuks, they were a very large empire. In their climax, they ruled from Iran all the way to Western Anatolia, and they'd gone all the way down and were also in control of the Hijaz. So really, they were a very, very powerful empire and very large empire. But obviously, not much is known about them by the Muslims of today. But it's very important to research about this empire and see what they contributed to the Islamic world, because again, under the Seljuk Empire, there was a lot of advances in science. For example, just one thing to really exemplify this is Imam al-Ghazali. He studied and was living under the Seljuk Empire. So really we can see how important the Seljuk Empire was to the advancement of science, and they are a very, very important empire to study. So I do hope that inshallah you took benefit from this video and this brief history of the Battle of Manzikert, and you did learn something. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. وفي الأخرى إلى الخلد المصير وفي الأخرى